We live in a world of culture wars, don't we? Of social justice warriors, anti-fat activists, third wave feminists, Black Lives Matter, and so on. These people can seem to be very angry and forceful, with no platforming motions and physical demonstrations to deny those they disagree with the right to speak, as well as emitting provocative and extreme critiques on social media. On the other hand, we also have the alt-right, Gamergate, MRAs, MGTOW and so on, arguing back and maintaining a clash between progressives and conservatives. So what is going on? Is this just some rabbit hole our civilization has gone down, or is there some logic to it? How would a theoretical historian see these things? The place I would start is with Jack Goldstone's Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. Goldstone has a theory known as structural demographic theory, which he uses to explain the French Revolution of 1789 and the English Civil War or Great Rebellion of 1642 to 1660. The structural demographic theory is basically Malthusian, which means it's based on the ideas of Thomas Malthus, who was an English clergyman living in the 18th-19th century. What bothered Malthus was that population tends to increase much faster than the technology needed to support it. So the number of people we can feed depends on our technology. In the old Stone Age, when humans were foragers living directly off the land, there couldn't be many of them because a large population would soon eat everything in sight and would have to keep moving faster than humanly possible. When people invented agriculture, they could get more food from the same amount of land, so they could feed more people. Population could go up. And over the millennia, our agricultural technology has steadily improved, and we've been able to support larger and larger populations. The maximum number of people you can support with your agricultural technology is known as the carrying capacity of the land. So Malthus observed that carrying capacity has increased over history, but at a rather slow and steady pace. On a graph, it looks something like this. On the other hand, population can grow very fast. If there's nothing to stop them, human populations can grow at least 3% per year, which means they can double in 25 years, a generation. So if you start with a population of 1, after 1 generation it will have doubled to 2. After 2 generations its size will be 4. After 3 generations, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024. After 10 generations, it will have increased by a factor of 1,000. On a graph, it looks like this. This is exponential growth. If we put the two graphs together, it's fairly obvious that however low the population starts from, it's soon going to shoot past the carrying capacity. So there will be more people than the land can support. Since you can't have a population bigger than the land can support, not for more than a short while, something has to give. Something has to hold the population in check. Malthus suggested that there are 2 kinds of check on population growth, positive and negative. Positive checks are things that actually kill people off once the population has got too big. Famine, obviously, with not enough food to go around, but also disease, since a big population makes it easy for epidemics to spread. And if people are starving, their immune systems are probably weakened as well. And also war, because if food is scarce, people are more likely to start fighting over it. On the other hand, if population is close to carrying capacity and there is not enough to go around, people will be poor, so they may not be able to afford to get married. And if they do get married, they will want fewer children. These are what Malthus called the negative checks. Nobody actually dies, but people who might have been born aren't. So when population growth reaches its limit, it can cause a higher death rate, the positive checks, or a lower birth rate, the negative checks, or both. And as a result, population growth decreases and may even become negative, i.e. with a population crash. So by this logic, we can expect to see Malthusian cycles. Population increases exponentially until it hits the carrying capacity. Population stops growing or falls until it is low enough or technology has increased enough that it can start growing again, and the cycle repeats. We do actually see these Malthusian effects in history. For example, this graph shows the age of marriage in the Netherlands over a period of a century. We can see how it goes up and down, and that can be related to the state of the economy. Similarly, this graph from Jack Goldstone's book shows the close correlation between population growth and wheat prices. The interpretation is that as population grew, there was less wheat, less food to go round, and so it became more expensive by the law of supply and demand. So this is the demographic part of structural demographic theory. It's all about population, about demographics, specifically demographic cycles. But Goldstone noticed a problem with this theory. Logically, as soon as population has decreased even a little relative to carrying capacity, it should be able to start growing again. So we should see something like this. Population should always be bumping along close to the population limit. So we shouldn't really see any cycles, or if there are cycles, they should be very short. But this isn't what happens. As seen in this graph, which covers 300 years, the cycle is quite leisurely, and in general Goldstone found that the downswings lasted a lot longer than you would expect. It seems that after population has hit carrying capacity and begun to fall, it takes a rather long time before it recovers and goes back on the track of exponential growth. So Goldstone argued that there is another process involved, one that causes these extended downswings. This is called elite overproduction. So what is this all about? Well, when population is close to carrying capacity, there are too many people, and this means not only that food is scarce, but also that jobs may be scarce. In economists' terms, there is an abundant supply of labour, and by the law of supply and demand, that makes labour cheap. In other words, people will work for less. With too many people chasing not enough jobs, they will be desperate for work and will accept lower wages. So during the overpopulation phases of the Malthusian cycle, we should find that wages fall. More precisely, it is real wages that fall. Sometimes it's not that wages actually fall in money terms. Instead, the price of everything goes up so that the purchasing power of people's wages goes down. It makes little difference whether wages fall or prices go up. The end result is that people can't get as much for their money and they are worse off. So we talk about falls in real wages, what wages are actually worth in your pocket. Now, while falls in real wages are bad for workers, they are very good for the elite. When labour is cheap, it means they don't need to pay their workers so much. or they can hire more workers for the same amount of money. So while the population in general is worse off, the elite are better off. And because they are better off, they are likely to marry earlier and have bigger families. So when ordinary people are struggling due to overpopulation, the elite is booming. Not only does the elite join in the general overpopulation, but it increases faster than the general population. So this is the structural part of Goldstone's theory. There is a change in the social structure, with the elite coming to make up a larger fraction of the whole society. The problem with this expansion of the elite is that society only has room for a certain number of elite. As the elite expands, there is growing pressure to find roles for them all so that they can enjoy the status they expect. To give a concrete illustration, suppose that in some historical society there are 1,000 noble families, and suppose that in normal times each noble family produces on average roughly one male heir. Only a few families produce a second son, so let's say on average there are 20 second sons in each generation. Then the 1,000 first sons are okay because they can inherit the noble title from their fathers. They have a definite role within the elite. But the second sons are in a more precarious position. They don't really have a role, and they are in danger of falling out of the elite. But what tends to happen is that the second sons find prestigious roles as government bureaucrats, or as bishops in the church, or military commanders. In general, we can say that they find a purpose in life as officials of the state. The state steps in to provide the excess elite with positions appropriate for their status. And that, of course, costs money because they need salaries sufficient to support elite lifestyles. Now, suppose that the elite expands by the mechanism we have just discussed, i.e., in a period of overpopulation and falling real wages, the elite experiences a boom. Let's say that instead of 20 second sons, there are now more like 200 second sons in every generation. This means that the number of elite has expanded from 1,020 to 1,200, an increase of roughly 20%. Again, the 1,000 firstborn sons are okay, inheriting their father's positions. This doesn't change. But the number of superfluous elite has changed dramatically, from 20 to 200, 10 times as many, or an increase of 900%. So the effect of elite expansion on the pressure for state-supplied positions is much greater than you might expect. Even though the elite has only expanded by 20%, the number of the elite seeking state positions has increased by 900%. In other words, elite overexpansion puts a great burden on the government and on state institutions to absorb the excess with appropriate roles. And that 900% increase in the number of elites seeking such roles means a 900% increase in the cost to the state to fund these roles. As the elite continues to expand and the state struggles to find roles for them all, perhaps having to downgrade the pay and status of many of the officials, you get an intense competition for these positions. So the elite, which was formerly quite cohesive, bonded together by marriage and class interests, is increasingly divided against itself, with individuals and factions vying to keep their power and privileges. One of the visible signs of this is what is called credentialing, a new emphasis on getting credentials, which particularly means academic qualifications. In the old days, when most of the elite youth could expect to inherit their parents' wealth and status, they didn't bother to go to university. But with overexpansion, the elite youth increasingly get themselves degrees and diplomas to give them a better chance in the competition for state offices. This graph shows the fluctuation in student numbers at Oxford University between 1500 and 1850. It peaked in the middle of the 17th century, precisely when there was a population crisis and a great expansion of the elite resulting in the English Civil War. After the crisis passed into the 18th century, university attendance fell again. Now, this is the crux of Goldstone's theory. He says that revolutions never occur just because the masses are unhappy. Malthusian overpopulation may make people poor and distressed, and there may be local unrest, but the elite controls the army and has all the power, and provided it stays united and supports the state and the elite together can always keep down the masses. The problem only comes when there is this intra-elite competition, when the elite is divided against itself, at war with itself. You get what structural demographic theory calls a counter-elite. These are people who, because of their birth and upbringing, feel that they have an entitlement to elite positions, but who miss out because of the intense competition, or at least don't get positions as good as they think they deserve. These counter-elite are very dangerous. They are like people who expected to be invited to the banquet, but weren't, and in their kind of jealous rage, they are ready to rip away the tablecloths and send all the dishes clattering to the floor. If they can't get a seat at the banquet, then no one will. They are ready to destroy the whole thing. We can think of it in terms of the social pyramid that goes back to Machiavelli. Society consists of the one, the ruler, the state, the few, the elite, and the many, the masses, the common people. Any two of these can dominate the other. If either the masses are happy or the elite are happy, they will align with the state, and it doesn't matter whether the other is happy or not. But when the many is unhappy and the few is unhappy, then they combine together in their unhappiness, and they can overthrow the one, the state, so you get a political revolution. So in Goldstone's theory, if you want to explain when social breakdowns occur, like the French Revolution or the English Civil War, you need to look at two things: the mass mobilization potential, which measures the stress of ordinary people due to food shortages and falling wages, and the elite mobilization potential, which measures the stress among the elite due to overexpansion and competition for status. But there's also a third thing called state fiscal distress. This is a measure of the state's ability to balance its budget, to meet its financial obligations. As I said, when the elite is expanding, the state needs to find positions to keep them all happy, and this gets expensive. It also comes at what is a bad time anyway, because society generally is poor and stressed out, so it's harder for the state to raise taxes, and it also probably needs to spend more on poor relief and on police and security to keep down the potential for crime and disorder. So the state is between a rock and a hard place, and it gets to the point where something has to give. It can't afford to keep the elite happy and alleviate hunger and suppress unrest, and these problems of funding the state contribute to its collapse. So Goldstone's theory involves these three factors, and he multiplies them together to get what he calls the political stress index, PSI. The PSI equals mass mobilization potential times elite mobilization potential times state fiscal distress. Since PSI spells out the Greek letter psi, he also writes it that way: psi equals MMP times EMP times SFD. And what he shows is that psi, calculated in this way, reached a peak in England just at the time of the English Civil War, when the parliamentarian army under Oliver Cromwell overthrew King Charles and eventually beheaded him. The war broke out in 1642, and King Charles was beheaded in 1649. The pub name, the Royal Oak, refers to the incident after the Battle of Worcester in 1651, when Charles's son Charles II escaped by hiding in an oak tree and eventually got away to France. Cromwell ruled the country as a kind of dictator until he died in 1658. By this time people were getting fed up with parliamentarian rule, and in 1660 the monarchy was restored and Charles II returned from France to be king. In the same way, Goldstone shows that the Psi index reached a peak in France just at the outbreak of the French Revolution. As is well known, that led to a lot of turmoil, with factions fighting each other and decapitations with the guillotine. In France, the monarchy was also eventually restored, but that didn't work out, and today France is a republic. So Goldstone's structural demographic theory seems to work, and it also explains why the Malthusian cycles last a long time, rather than population quickly recovering so it tracks along with the growth of carrying capacity. Because the problem is not just overpopulation. The whole of society breaks down and there is civil war and widespread disruption, and it takes a generation or more for that to work itself out and for the elite to shrink back to a more manageable level. The theoretical historians Peter Turchin and Sergei Nefedov have taken this structural demographic theory and applied it to a whole range of cases and shown that it holds up very well. They consider 4 societies: England, France, ancient Rome and Russia. And for each society they consider 2 successive periods. For example, in England they consider the Middle Ages and the Wars of the Roses, as well as the Tudor-Stuart period and the English Civil War considered by Jack Goldstone. What they do is assemble lots of statistics to calculate the various ingredients of Psi. For example, this chart of enrolments at Oxford University is from their book. In every case, they show there is this clear structural demographic cycle which operates the way I have described. Population expands until it reaches the Malthusian limit, the carrying capacity, and you have overpopulation. This means wages fall and labour is cheap, which gives you a high mass mobilisation potential. But it also allows the elite to expand, as a result of which there is increased elite competition, so you have a high elite mobilisation potential. And these changes in society, impoverishment and elite competition, mean that the state has falling revenues from taxation, coupled with increasing obligations and expenditure, leading to high state fiscal distress. It all ends in tears, with political breakdown and population collapse, a crash and reset, taking you back to underpopulation, a small elite, etc. And this situation allows population to grow again, and it's a case of rinse and repeat. Peter Turchin has also written a book applying the theory to the United States. He finds that the American Civil War can be explained as a classic example of a structural demographic cycle, and the US is now in another cycle which is heading towards its own crunch and crisis. According to Turchin's analysis, the structural demographic cycle used to take 2 or 3 centuries from start to finish, but with the increased pace of modern life this has speeded up, and the cycle now takes about a century and a half. By that reckoning, the US is getting pretty close to a new political breakdown and social calamity, whatever form that might take. Pretty much the same thing applies to the whole of the West. It's not necessarily that population has been expanding rapidly in recent decades. As we know, Western populations are aging and fertility is declining, though growth is still quite strong in some parts. The population of the UK was 56 million in the 1970s and is 66 million today, and is expected to reach 72 million by the year 2040. But it's not just about population growth, it's also that carrying capacity hasn't been increasing as fast because technology is growing more slowly. To give an example, humans landed on the moon 50 years ago, but spaceflight remains a marginal activity with just a few astronauts in space at a time. Compare that with the way in 50 years you went from the Wright Flyer, the first powered aircraft, to a global airline industry already carrying tens of millions of people a year. If you look at the Wikipedia inventions timeline, which I know isn't 100% reliable but gives you a flavour of the issue, it turns out the peak decade for inventions was the 1960s, and that is followed by the 1900s and the 1860s rather than by more recent decades. If we had continued to develop spaceflight and lunar exploration, that would have created lots of jobs, as well as opened up new resources, including abundant solar energy and metal ores and other valuable raw materials on the moon. And that would have absorbed the increase in population. But that hasn't happened. Carrying capacity hasn't expanded fast enough to support population growth. So Western countries look as though they are in the overpopulation phase of the Malthusian structural demographic cycle. There are various signs of that which Turchin describes in great detail in his book. For example, real wages have been falling, and it's not difficult to find headlines about middle classes feeling the pinch, and particularly about young people not being able to expect the kind of lifestyles their parents enjoyed. So labour has got cheaper, and it is boom time for the top elite, with pay gaps widening. At the bottom, though, there is growing mass mobilisation potential, most visibly in France recently, but also elsewhere under the surface as people struggle with debt and job insecurity. The yellow vests seem to have come into existence because of new taxes, which would increase an already painful cost of living. I travel to France quite regularly, and food prices there are high, definitely higher than in the UK. Overpopulation, falling standards of living, rising food prices, it's all pretty classic from a structural demographic point of view. At the same time, we see a rise in credentialing, an indication of growing elite competition. In the UK, university attendance has expanded dramatically over the last few decades. Student numbers have almost doubled in just one generation since the 1990s. So population has increased by 15% in that time, but the number of students has increased by almost 100%, a classic example of elite overexpansion. Peter Turchin presents a telling series of graphs showing the starting salaries of American law school graduates from 1991 to 2000. In the 1990s, there was a fairly even distribution, but by the year 2000, there was a separation into winners and losers. The implication is that the people on these high salaries have made it into the real elite, but the people on these lower salaries are kind of semi-failures, not doing so well in the competition for elite status. Given all this, we could see SJWs, social justice warriors, as a counter-elite. They are typically university-educated, reasonably intelligent, ambitious young people, but they are resentful or pessimistic about their chances of getting into the elite. They consider themselves entitled to membership of the elite, but they sense that the opportunities aren't there. The state doesn't have the resources to absorb them properly into the establishment, and since they seem destined to remain outside it, they put themselves in opposition to it. As would be predicted by structural demographic theory, they want to tear down the existing establishment. If they can't be a part of it, they want to destroy it, smash the patriarchy, end white supremacy. Heterosexual white males are of course their primary targets because they are the visible face of the elite that has dominated the recent centuries of the structural demographic cycle. SJWism is all about delegitimizing that elite and challenging its right to its position. There's also a parallel between SJWs and the Puritans who grew in numbers before the English Civil War. Puritans came to dominate Parliament and criticise the king, and it was when Charles tried to arrest some of them that war broke out. So Puritanism was part of the final stage of the structural demographic cycle, i.e. the stage of overpopulation, falling incomes and elite overexpansion, just as I'm suggesting SJW attitudes are today. In both cases there is a lack of tolerance for human frailty and imperfections, for the fact that people might be rude or offensive, a bit racist, a bit sexist. Instead, there is an urge to purify society, to eradicate wrong behaviours and wrong thinking. The Puritans banned Christmas, gambling and mixed dancing, to them ridding the world of things that were religiously incorrect, to others taking the fun out of life. And today people might see SJWs as taking the fun out of things in the campaign to make everyone a better person. But SJWs are not necessarily the only kind of counter-elite, nor perhaps the most effective. Some would see President Trump and Nigel Farage as counter-elite figures, outside the existing establishment, challenging its cosy arrangements, disrupting the consensus. President Trump with his threat to drain the swamp, and Nigel Farage delivering Brexit, breaking up the European Union against the wishes of the political and business elite. To the establishment, these are dangerous Pied Piper figures who have exploited mass discontent to attack and overthrow the state, or at least overthrow the existing state of affairs. And if structural demographic theory is correct, there should be more to come, because the cycle isn't over yet. We should expect a full-blown political crisis, something of the order of the Civil War, English or American, and then a general breakdown and reset. And this brings us to MGTOW, men going their own way. We know from the theory that we should see population falling back from the Malthusian limit. That can be through Malthus's positive checks, an increase in the death rate from poverty and violence, or preferably it can be through Malthus's negative checks, a decrease in the birth rate. Now, the point of MGTOW is for men to avoid marriage and families, above all to avoid having children. So-called MGTOW monks are against having sexual relations or any kind of contact with women. This is based on the perception that interactions with women have become dangerous for men, and that fatherhood is definitely a bad deal for men, as there is a high statistical likelihood they will lose custody of their children while being required to pay crippling rates of child support. Now, such a movement among men is obviously detrimental to the birth rate. Perhaps it can be compensated to some extent by women having artificial insemination, but that's also under threat, at least in the UK, where removal of anonymity for sperm donors has led to a drastic drop in the number of volunteers. And in any case, young women are tending to put their careers ahead of having children, so it cuts the other way too. Feminist ideas are also restricting the birth rate. The upshot is that MGTOW and feminism, its counterpart, are serving the classic function of Malthusian negative checks. They may have various particular causes and ideologies, doesn't matter. They are arriving just on cue in the structural demographic cycle. Something like MGTOW is precisely what we should expect. And we've been here before. As the Roman Empire went into terminal decline, birth rates plummeted, and a contributory factor was the growing tendency for people to become monks. This began with St. Anthony in Egypt in the 3rd to 4th century and became something of a craze. Women joined it too. In the middle of the 4th century, a rich widow founded 3 monasteries for women at Bethlehem and 1 for men. So MGTOW monks, feminists and SJWs see themselves as driven by particular motives to reject gynocentrist institutions, to fight male privilege and white domination. Of course, there are real issues at stake, but the way these ideologies lead to behaviour that matches what we expect from structural demographic theory suggests that at some presumably subconscious level, the ideologies have been shaped by the features of this stage of the Malthusian cycle: feelings of impoverishment, intensified elite competition, and overstretch of state resources. MGTOW and the rest think and act as they do for the reasons they give, but it seems that society has this amazing capacity for self-regulation, which means that overpopulation results in people having experiences, behaviours and opinions that inevitably cause population to fall back.